Hey guys, tonight we slip silently into the dim glow of a medieval scriptorium, where the scent of damp stone mingles with worn parchment and candle wax, drips in slow rivulets down blackened walls, quills poised like silent sentinels. You probably won't survive this next level of monastic monotony, meticulous as it is, but trust me, you'll be glad you stuck around. Ancient scripts whisper tales under quivering candle flames, beckoning you deeper into dusty mystery as parchment crackles beneath careful fingertips. Every tiny brushstroke of ink holds a secret about berries you never knew you needed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to post your location and local time in the comments so we can stitch together our own global timeline. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you blink, the candlelight snaps you to attention, and you rise to your feet, boots whispering against flagstones slick with centuries of foot traffic. In the hush, a single monk clears his throat, a small human sound that feels loud in the vaulted hush. You inch forward on slippers that have scuffed these stones for generations, and you see rows of wooden desks, each laden with open ledgers, quill pens, and ink pots. A chill drifts in from the narrow window slit, carrying the faint promise of berry-sweet air from the orchards outside. Monastic scribes, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, adjust their cowls, and you can almost smell the tartness of elderberries mingled with the faint trace of mead fermenting beyond these walls. The head scribe, a tall figure draped in wool, lifts a brittle parchment leaf and calls out the previous day's tally in a low melodic chant. 12 pints of blackberry, 8 of elder. Each number is repeated, confirmed by a junior brother, and then committed to ink with a steady hand. You hover near a wooden beam, carved with runes, an ancient wood-cutting detail that once served as a mnemonic for harvest dates. Your heart picks up a lazy rhythm as if you've joined some unspoken dance of ritual and record. Outside, a cold dawn light seeps through the window, painting the room in aquamarine shadows that quiver across gnarled archways. As you settle against a cool pillar, you notice the monk's inkwell is fashioned from a hollowed acorn cap, secured by a thin iron band. A fringe rumor says that monks believed lunar phases influenced the vigor of fermentation, so they harvested only under a waning moon to ensure sweeter yields. You arch an eyebrow. This odd belief seems outlandish, but it adds character to the drab routine. Historians still argue whether these superstitions had any true effect on mead quality, or were simply the product of long nights and bored minds. By the 6th century, the rule of Saint Benedict had codified monastic life, insisting that idleness is the enemy of the soul, and so work in the scriptorium became as sacred as prayer. This mainstream historical fact grounds you in a world where leafing through ledgers was both a pious duty and an economic necessity. Silent as a shadow, you watch a monk carefully weigh a small leather pouch of dried berries on a crude scale, 2 brass plates connected by a slender chain. Each measurement is jotted down with a flourish as the quill clicks against parchment, like distant rainfall on a tin roof. A sudden breeze stirs the faint candle smoke, and you inhale deeply, catching the tang of fermenting berries mingled with old vellum. A nearby scribe pauses, sniffing the air as if assessing the aroma of a fine wine. You tuck your robe tighter around your shoulders and take a step closer, drawn into the sacred choreography. Tools clatter softly, tiny weights, quill holders, and small knives for trimming parchment edges, all arranged with military precision. Your eyes dart to the margin of the ledger. Someone has drawn a tiny smiling berry with a halo of ink strokes. A quirky or fringed tidbit emerges. Legend has it that this little doodle was meant to invoke blessing spirits for the next harvest. Somehow, it humanizes the austere facts and figures, reminding you that even the most rigid routines harbor small acts of whimsy. You grin, picturing sugar-starved Vikings raiding monasteries not just for treasure, but for barrels of this sacred mead. Across the desk, a junior brother coughs and reaches for a damp rag blotting a small spill of red juice. He mumbles something about a cat that once toppled a full keg of blackberry mash, leading to impromptu cleanup duty at dawn. Another marginal note in faded ink. You imagine that stray feline padding through aisles of desks, whiskers stained burgundy, before scurrying away to hide under the brewer's table. The head scribe lowers his voice, calling for quiet as he prepares to tally the daily aggregate. You notice scratch marks where earlier scribes corrected mistakes, tiny X's and arrows guiding new numbers into place. The room grows still, every breath held in silent anticipation of the next quill stroke. You press your palm to the cool stone pillar and feel the faint heartbeat of history beneath your fingers. As the scribe finally dips his quill and touches ink to parchment, you lean in. The scratch of metal nib against vellum echoes like a distant drumbeat. In this moment, you're no longer an outsider. You're part of this living ledger, every jot and tittle carrying weight beyond mere numbers. Here at dawn in the scriptorium, the world beyond these walls feels distant, yet you sense that every fermented pint recorded here will ripple across markets, monasteries, and time itself. You slip through a low, rounded doorway into the monastery's walled garden, and a rush of morning air carries the tart perfume of berries ripening on heavy bushes. Moss-clad cobblestones press under your sandals as you wander between neat rows of elder and blackberry plants, each bush pruned with almost surgical precision. The sun, still low, sifts through latticework of wooden trellises, painting motes of gold across glossy leaves. Dew drips from thorny stems, plinking softly into the soil, like tiny bells announcing your arrival. You reach out to brush a finger over a dark, plump berry that blushes like a bruise, and you can almost hear it whisper, "Pick me." By the 9th century, Benedictine monasteries had become renowned for their cloister gardens, which combined fruits, vegetables, and medicinal herbs to ensure self-sufficiency and care for the sick, factoring heavily into their vow of hospitality. This mainstream historical fact anchors you. These monks weren't horticultural dilettantes, but innovators who planted mulberry trees alongside healing plants like chicory and feverfew. Here, amidst the orderly greenery, the promise of sour, sweet flavors tangles with the scent of damp earth and faint cedar from the nearby chapel. You inhale deeply, savoring that vegetal, almost woody note that bleeds into your memory long after you leave. You recall the acorn inkwell from dawn's ledger ritual, the hollowed nut where ink pooled like midnight. Now you spot tiny acorn caps strewn among fallen leaves, repurposed as makeshift cups for stray snails. A fringed tidbit floats through your mind. Legend claims that monks once traded these acorn cups to forest spirits in exchange for richer yields, burying them upside down at each bush's root. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were genuine beliefs or clever ploys to keep curious peasants away. Either way, the practice adds a spark of whimsy to the austere routine. The path curves past a wooden arbor where vines twist around stout beams in elaborate knots. You run your hand along one coil, feeling the vine's sinewy life force. Berries cluster in tight bunches overhead, their purple-black skins taut and glossy. A robin alights on a branch, its chest puffed and throat wobbling, as it sings a short, scratchy tune that seems to celebrate the harvest. You almost expect it to wear a clerical hat. Jokes aside, these birds are more than decorative. They help control pests by feasting on larvae that threaten swaths of fruit. If these monks were the original hipsters, they'd probably add a fresh berry mead section to the garden's Instagram feed, though you suspect they'd call it an illuminated manuscript. A low wooden bench rests beneath a trellis, its surface slick with morning moisture. You sit and watch a brother approach, carrying a woven basket filled to the brim with elderberries, their tiny stems still attached. He moves in slow, deliberate steps, like a dancer in an ancient ritual. His hood shadows his face, but you glimpse a soft grin as he selects only the ripest handful. He murmurs a prayer before tucking them into his tunic's pocket, act part, devotion part, quality control. A second brother follows, humming a tune that sounds suspiciously like a folk song you once heard in a tavern. Drink the honey wine, let your spirits dine. You stifle a chuckle. You never thought you'd hear monks remixing barcarolle. Rows of blackberry hedges stand like disciplined soldiers, their thorny branches enmeshed in a lattice of ropes and stakes. You run a fingertip across a single branch, noting the small thorns that could pierce leather with ease. A fringe rumor whispers that monks once wore extra layers of wool to avoid these scratches, but others say they deliberately grabbed at thorns to show penitence for their sins. You feel the chill of that contrast, penance and pleasure, thorns and fruit. Historians still argue whether these penitential rituals were widespread or merely penned by a single overzealous scribe. Sunlight warms your shoulders as you stand and circle back toward a small greenhouse built of oiled linen stretched over a wooden frame. Inside, tender shoots of gooseberries and currants thrive in the humid air. You catch the humidity through the woven fabric like a tropical greenhouse adrift in a northern winter. A clerk once annotated the ledger here with a note, "Gooseberries for cough pick at dawn." Even in the margins of yield counts, you glimpse snippets of daily life. Monks believed that gooseberry cordial soothed sore throats better than any worldly remedy, another quirk that sounds like it belongs in a medieval medicine show. Beyond the greenhouse, a swath of ground marked by small stakes and string shows where black currants once grew. The earth lies fallow, now waiting for the next planting season. You bend to touch the soil. It feels cool and crumbly, like well-aged compost. A stray petal from a honeysuckle vine drifts down and settles onto your forearm, its pale pink hue stark against your robe. You brush it away, tucking it behind your ear like a playful nod to simpler times before ledger rows and harvest quotas. It's a momentary rebellion against duty, but the hush of the garden nudges you back into reverence. You follow a narrow path lined with stone markers carved with crosses and dates, each one commemorating a particularly bountiful year or a harvest lost to hailstorms. One marker notes Anno Domini 1032 blackberry, autumn frost. A chill sweeps through you as you read it. You wonder if the monks there, huddled around a mead barrel, watching crystals form on the berries' skins. That detail carries weight, reminding you that even this verdant sanctuary could fall prey to weather's whims. You smile at the mental image, frost-crusted berries crowning a barrel like jeweled armor. A distant bellow from the cook's hut punctuates the piece, someone calling for more elderberry stock for the kitchen. You glance toward a low building where steam curls from its chimney and a monk bustles out carrying a ladle dripping deep red syrup. You picture a giant porridge pot bubbling with berries, and you imagine whether they spiced it with herbs or crushed goose hilts, another catchy term scribes used for tart gooseberries. You might think the only thing holy about these gardens is the dirt under your nails, but in every drop of juice there lingers the devotion of 1,000 careful hands. As the sun climbs, shadows shift beneath the trellis, and you decide to wander back toward the cloister walls. Each footstep carries you farther from this fragrant haven, yet the perfume of berries clings to your nostrils. You pause at the gate, hand resting on its ancient latch, and look back at the ordered rows disappearing into bright morning haze. In that moment, you're keenly aware that behind every ledger entry lies a living, breathing orchard. You step through the doorway and carry that knowledge with you, knowing tomorrow you'll return to record even more of this sour, sweet bounty. You push open the heavy oak door and slip back into the scriptorium where the candlelight flickers against stacked parchment and the sharp tang of ink fills the air. The scent is unmistakable. Iron-tinged oak gall ink mingles with a faint mustiness of animal hide, and each inhalation feels like stepping into another time. Desks of pale maple stand in neat rows, their surfaces etched with old scratches at the faint ghost of red wax seals. You kneel at one fingertips, grazing a shallow groove where a scribe once sharpened a quill. The hush here is thick enough to taste, except when the quill scratch echoes, reminding you that every sound is an invitation to lean closer. By the 9th century, parchment made from calfskin, known as vellum, had largely supplanted papyrus in northern Europe, prized for its strength and longevity, and monasteries became the main centers for its production. You run a thumb along a loose scrap, feeling the subtle grain beneath your skin, and imagine the labor-required hair scraped away with pumice flesh, slid off with flensing knives, and the stretched skin left to dry under tension. Fringe lore suggests a few scribes believed that blessing each stretched skin with holy water ensured that their records would never fade, but historians still argue whether such rituals were earnest or simply stoked the ego of an overzealous abbot. Your eyes lift to the inkstand, a hollowed acorn cap perched on an iron ring, its interior stained purple-black. A small ceramic pot holds crushed oak galls iron sulfate and gum arabic ready to be mixed with water alchemy disguised as mundane office work. You remember that acorn inkwell from Dawn's ledger tally, and you almost expect a snail to climb out wearing its borrowed cap. A light joke flits through your mind. If medieval office supplies had a team-building retreat, they'd surely vote the ink pot MVP for most likely to stain. Lines ruled in pale, almost ghostly lead stretch across the parchment pages, framing columns wide enough for dates, berry types, and measured yields. You follow the groove of a ruling pen, a thin metal rod with a sharp edge drawn steadily from top to bottom, leaving behind uniform guides that would later be traced in sepia ink. Margin spaces are generous, ready for colophons or scribbled notes. Historians still argue whether these deep margins served primarily for decoration annotation or concealed musical notation to accompany scriptural readings. But you suspect it was all three. A row of goose feather quills lies arranged by length and nib shape, each clipped with a small knife to form a crisp angle. You pick one up, its hollow shaft cool between your fingers, its grayish-white plume flickering as you tilt it. Fringe rumor holds that some brothers chewed the tips with their teeth to test sharpness, leaving behind tiny tooth marks as personal signatures. You chuckle softly, imagine scouring a vellum for centuries to find a scribe's bite mark, a medieval signature of impatience. You dip the quill into inkwell, sensing the suction as the nib fills, then press down on the ledge of the desk and bring the tip to parchment. The scratch is soft but precise, a delicate whisper that vibrates in your bones. A light joke plays on your lips. You'd never do this after coffee. Jittery hands and fine ink do not mix. A tiny flick of the wrist draws the first digit of today's harvest, a looping one, with a spur at the base, then a straight line, then a final curl. You pause to admire the scribe's flourish, as if each number were an artful signature. On the corner of the page, a small smiling berry wearing a halo winks up at you the same doodle you spotted yesterday. That quirky scribble reminds you that even in the most rigid accounting, whimsy carved its way into margins. A fringe detail insists this drawing was thought to bless the yields recorded on that sheet, though no one quite knows who drew it. Historians still debate whether such doodles served as mnemonic devices or simply relieved the tedium of endless tallying. You step back to inspect an open ledger laid flat on a wooden stand, its pages held in place by lead weights tied with leather cords. Columns are labeled in ruby red ink, a process called rubrication, so that elderberry and blackberry leap from the page at first glance. Monastic scribes often reserved red ink for headings to guide readers, a mainstream historical fact corroborated by countless illuminated manuscripts. Fringe rumor claims some used fox blood when supplies ran low, resulting in shrieking corrections from the infirmarian. You snort quietly. You can't help but wonder whether that's true or just a tale spun by a scribe with a flair for drama. The layout of each ledger page glows under the candle's warm halo, 4 vertical columns for date berry type weight in pounds and fermented yield in pints, followed by a narrow 5th column for notes. You trace the columns with your finger, feeling the shallow indentations left by the ruling pen. Beneath today's entries, A tiny cross marks a batch spoiled by unexpected frost, an echo of the Anno Domini 1032 marker in the garden. You recall the chill you felt reading that date, and now you feel the echo of loss inked to this very page. A dagger-shaped stylus lies at the page's edge used earlier to score lines before ruling. You pick it up and heft its weight. It feels surprisingly balanced, like a pen reincarnated as a miniature sword. A light joke forms: if you brandished this in a dim alley, you'd probably just get strange looks not daring do. You return it gently and notice a smear of wax from the ceiling candle, evidence of the head scribe's impatience, sealing off last night's work. Over by the window, a junior brother consults a scrap of wax tablet where initial drafts were jotted. The slate-gray surface is inscribed with rough tally marks of berries tested for sweetness before fermentation. You remember the experiment with gooseberries for cough remedies, and you wonder how many of those made it to the final ledger. This little interplay between draft and finalized record underscores the scribe's process rough idea to polished entry, much like rough drafts in modern word processors. Except here, the delete button was a damp sponge and a dagger edge. The scriptorium's quiet is broken only by the occasional drip of wax and the rhythmic scratching of quill on parchment. Every so often, a monk steps forward to deliver a new pot of ink or to remove the completed folio to the archive. You inhale the dense mixture of aromas, ink, leather, beeswax feeling wrapped in centuries of devotion and discipline. With each measured stroke, you realize that these ledgers were not mere numbers, but living records that shaped monastic economics, agricultural innovation, and even social structures beyond cloister walls. As you stand, you run your palm across a finished page, its ink dry and smooth. The featherweight of history rests under your fingertips. The tools here, the quill, the inkwell, the ruled parchment, are humble conduits of human expectancy, capturing hopes that each pint of fermented berry would usher in nourishment trade and perhaps divine favor. You close the ledger, gently mindful of its fragility, and tuck the quill back in its wooden rack. You glance at the next empty page, ready for today's numbers, and feel the same anticipation you felt in the garden at dawn, knowing that every digit, every drop of ink maps a journey from blossom to barrel. You settle back onto a low bench beside a row of iron balances, their brass pans suspended from delicate chains that gleam in candlelight. The faint click of metal on stone echoes through the scriptorium as you run a finger along a polished weight, its surface etched with tiny nicks from centuries of use. A breath of cool air drifts through the shuttered window, carrying with it the faint tang of fermented berry brine, and you feel the hush settle around you like a soft cloak. Here weight and volume whisper secrets to those who know how to listen. Monastic records often use the libra, a Latin pound roughly equivalent to 327 grams, as the base unit for berry weights, a mainstream historical fact found in countless Carolingian charters. You lift a smooth disc-shaped weight, stamped I1 pound, and then its neighbor marked OI. Each weight clicks sharply as it drops into the balance's pan. You slide a small sack of dried elderberries onto the opposite pan and watch the chain swing until the scales find equilibrium. A light joke drifts through your mind. You'd hate to be The poor novice who misplaces the third weight and accidentally declares 5 pounds of berries, as 3 talk about a vintage food scam. Once you note the Libra count, you scribble the number in the ledger's weight column. Next comes volume measured in sextarii, an ancient Roman pint of about half a liter that monks adopted for mead yields. You remember that ritual acorn inkwell from morning's tally, and you almost expect to dip into its ink again as you jot down sextarii for 5 pints of fermented juice. Fringe lore suggests some scribes greased their weights with snail slime to ensure a smoother scale motion, but historians still argue whether this slimy trick ever truly happened or was merely the product of overactive monastic imaginations. A low creak signals the entrance of Brother Aldhelm carrying a wooden bucket of newly pressed berry mash. The bucket's rim oozes deep crimson juice that drips in slow, sticky beads onto the flagstones. He dumps half the mash onto a piece of cloth, then employs a crude maslin press, a simple wooden board and lever, to extract the liquid. The squelch of berry pulp and the scent of fresh juice swirl around you, wrapping you in the tangible birth of mead. You inhale, tasting tart sweetness and imagining the fermentation to come. A light joke scuttles through your thoughts. If you wanted true ASMR, you just found it. Forget fans and whispered narrations. Once collected, the juice is funneled into a marked vat, each ring on its staves indicating a sextarius. You watch as the ruby liquid rises to the 4th ring, then you nod and whisper, IV, before Brother Aldhelm uses a small wooden ladle to transfer exactly 4 sextarii into waiting barrels. The liquid sloshes gently, and the scent sharpens like fresh pressed wine. A fringe detail surfaces. Rumor has it that some abbots calibrated fats by sight alone, arguing that precise rings hindered artistic intuition. Historians still debate whether these eyeball measures were effective or wildly inconsistent. You step over to a narrow table and see a rough parchment conversion table pinned under a wax seal. It lists Libra to sextaria ratios for different berry densities, elderberries densely packed, wood strawberries lighter and more volatile. The table's ink is smudged in places, evidence of hurried corrections made when a frost-ravaged batch required rapid remeasurement. You run a fingertip across the faded lines, feeling the slight raised edge where wax dripped. A light joke bubbles up. You wouldn't trust that table in a modern kitchen. You'd end up with underbaked biscuits and overzealous mead. A splayed plume of goose quills lies abandoned beside the table, each softened tip stained purple. You remember that scribbled berry halo doodle in the margin, and you search tills for a matching illustration here. Sure enough, a tiny barrel wearing a grin peeks from the bottom corner. That quirky emblem sparks a smile, the scribe's way of blessing the conversion chart, ensuring that ounces and pints align just right. Fringe gossip claims that anyone who ignored the doodle risked cursed mead that turned sour within a fortnight. Historians still argue whether this superstition influenced real brewing practices or simply added color to ledger margins. The head scribe glides into view, robes whispering against stone. He kneels and runs a slender stylus along the conversion table, then touches the tip to parchment and draws a faint line linking Libra entries to sextari totals. You note the elegance of his strokes, precise yet fluid like calligraphy in motion. A mainstream historical fact emerges. Medieval scribes often used conversion tables derived from Roman agricultural treatises, bridging ancient knowledge with contemporary needs. That lineage of learning pulses through each ruled line, a silent testament to centuries of scholarship. You lean closer to inspect small marginal notes beside the table. Might consider new ratio for blackcurrant reads one. Test yield under wax seal for accuracy reads another. These scribbles hint at scholarly debate even within cloister walls. Monks experimenting, comparing batches, refining methods. You recall the frost-marked stone in the garden, and you sense continuity. Every frost kill or bountiful bloom prompted revisions here in this very scriptorium. Historians still contend whether these incremental tweaks amounted to systematic agronomy or remained isolated experiments. The soft glow of a distant lamp catches the sheen on a small wooden box filled with lead weights shaped like discs, cones, and arrows. You lift the smallest arrow weight, maybe a half ounce, and feel its surprising heft. A light joke flits in your mind. If medieval weight shapes were a fashion trend, arrow weights would be the runway models. You place it into the scales pan, then transfer a ladleful of berry juice, waiting for the chain to swing into stillness. The balance tips ring ring until it halts perfectly poised. You record the exact fraction of a sextarius in fine looping script. Nearby, a junior brother consults a leather-bound volume on Benedictine agricultural rules, reciting aloud, use clear water to rinse weights, lest residue taint future measures. You watch as he fetches a small cloth from a basket and gently wipes the brass weight, then places it on a clean stand. The emphasis on purity echoes the broader monastic ethos, meticulous care in both divine matters and earthly ones. Fringe rumor even tells of a scribe who, in a moment of piety, soaked all his weights in holy water, though historians still argue whether he was sincere or simply eager to dodge kitchen duty. As the morning grows brighter, the lamp's glow fades and natural light floods the scriptorium. You rise, feeling a faint ache in your knees from constant leaning. You survey the row of ledgers, now populated with freshly converted figures, Libra and Sextaria, dancing side by side like partners in a solemn waltz. The numbers stand as testaments to human ingenuity, tools and measures devised to tame nature's bounty. A final light joke arises. You'd send these monks a micrometer and digital scale in a heartbeat just to watch their kerchiefs fly in surprised delight. You tuck the quill into a loop on your belt, run your fingers through a stray tuft of candle-scented smoke, and step away from the balances. You glance once more at the conversion table's doodle barrel and halo winking, and you smile, knowing that even the driest numbers carry a spark of personality. You leave the scriptorium floor, each clack of your sandals marking the end of another chapter in this ledger's life. Tomorrow, you'll return to record more weights, more volumes, and perhaps more doodles that illuminate the heart behind the numbers. You duck through a low stone arch and descend a few steps into the monastery's fermentation cellar, where the air is cool and heavy with the sweet tart scent of fruit and honey mingling with damp oak. Flickering sconces reveal rows of squat earthenware jars and stout oak barrels, each bearing faded chalk marks from last season's batches. A soft hiss escapes from a tightly sealed carboy as carbon dioxide finds its way through a small wax plug, and you feel the gentle vibration underfoot like the cellar itself is breathing. This is where tart berries transform into potent mead, and you're about to become part of the alchemy. The head brewer, Brother Cadfael, greets you with a nod, his woolen robe practically glowing in the amber lamplight. He gestures to a low wooden table piled high with crushed blackberry mash, elderberry pulp, and a small heap of wild honeycomb. You kneel beside him and dip a finger into the mash. It's sticky, grainy, and bursts with sweet sour juice like fruit gum that's gone decidedly rogue. You lean in to inhale. Microbes are already working, converting sugars to alcohol in a process that medieval brewers called ether fermentation, a mainstream historical fact documented in Carolingian brewing manuscripts. Brother Cadfael plucks a handful of crushed berries and drops them into a large barrel hollowed from oak, then ladles in clear water drawn from the cloister well. The barrel gurgles as the liquid rises. A fringe tidbit surfaces. Some monks believed that singing a specific hymn as they poured the mash encouraged yeast to flourish, though historians still argue whether these psalmic serenades had any real biochemical effect or were simply soothing background noise for sleepy brewers. You half expect a choir of invisible spirits to join in, but only the drip of stray berries falling from your fingertips answers back. Next, you watch Brother Cadfael break honeycomb into chunks, each piece glinting like golden rock candy. He crams them into the barrel until the liquid surface ripples with flecks of wax and pollen. You lean forward to scrape a bit of honey off a shard. Its warmth is surprising. A sunbeam tasting of floral fields and buzzing bees. A light joke flutters in your mind. If you'd tasted this in a trendy cafe today, you'd call it artisan berry mead latte, complete with whipped cream on top. Once the honey's added, Brother Cadfael fetches a small ceramic jar containing last season's fermented dregs, what brewers call lees. He dips a wooden paddle into the jar and stirs the new mash vigorously, coaxing those hardy yeast cells back to life. The mash bubbles and groans like a living thing foaming at the edges. You suppress a grin. It looks like potion making, except far tastier than turning someone into a frog. A light joke emerges. You can almost hear the yeast chanting, "Feed me, Seymour," as they feast on sugars. After the vigorous stir, you seal the barrel with a thick cork and coat it in melted beeswax, smearing the edge until it glistens. You pat it gently, noting the soft crackle as the wax sets. A fringe rumor whispers that some abbots marked each barrel with a drop of scented oil rose or lavender, so any early leaks smelled more like a garden than a brewery. Though historians still debate whether this was practical deodorizing or simply an excuse for monks to garden indoors. You imagine a barrel faintly redolent of roses, romantic, if you ignore the barnyard undertones. Across the room, you spot a tall stone floor well lined with slate, filled with fermenting vessels at varying stages. It's called the Grange Pit, where barrels rest in the cool darkness for weeks or months. You step over a puddle of sticky juice and crouch beside a half-buried barrel. When you lift the oak lid, a hiss of gas escapes, and you glimpse pale wisps of foam clinging to the rim. The temperature hovers around 12 degrees, ideal for slow, steady fermentation. A mainstream historical fact, medieval cellars naturally maintained cool temperatures, acting as early climate-controlled units long before refrigerators were a thing. You reach in with a ladle and dip a sip, wincing at the sharp sweet bite unfiltered primal mead, brimming with lively bubbles that fizz on your tongue like tiny fireworks. Brother Cadfael hands you a cloth and a small bowl. He instructs you to skim the foam called bloom from the surface and discard it because it carries unwanted yeasts and proteins. You dab at the froth, revealing clearer liquid beneath. A light joke drifts through your thoughts. This is medieval foam capping, not unlike modern latte art, except you won't see intricate hearts or leaves, just a clean pour for better flavor. Next, you note the color, a deep, bruised purple hue shifting toward mahogany as light strikes the curved staves. You dip a finger in again and lift it to the lamplight, watching droplets catch flickers like gems. A fringed detail. Some monks believed that the color signaled spiritual purity, insisting that darker mead was holier than pale, though historians still argue whether this was genuine belief or marketing spin for pilgrims thirsting for saintly spirits. You tilt your head, considering whether you could sell this batch to unsuspecting travelers as heaven approved. Brother Cadfael scribbles a note in a pocket ledger. Mash number 7. Yeast dregs added. Bloom removed. He flips to a blank page and draws a rough sketch of the barrel's bunghole, marking it with a cross. You recall the smiling berry doodle that brightened the ledger margins upstairs, and you spot a tiny barrel sketch here too, haloed by a ring of dots. That quirky emblem ties the brewery's record-keeping to the scriptorium's margins, a callback you can't help but appreciate. You stand and follow Brother Cadfael to a nearby shelf, where dozens of sealed jars rest, each containing a sample from previous batches. He selects one labeled 1035 Harvest and cracks the lid. A soft pop echoes in the cellar, and you inhale a warm honeyed aroma spiced by fermented berry overtones. You taste a drop on your fingertips, smooth mellow, with a faint hint of oak tannin that lingers at the back of your throat. A light joke surfaces. This tastes better than what you paid 8 coins for at the market stall in the plaza last week. He hands you a small scroll, an experimental recipe calling for a pinch of dried rosemary and crushed mint. According to the note, these herbs were tested to see if they sharpened clarity or added medicinal qualities. Fringe lore says the rosemary was meant to ward off nightmares, while mint supposedly eased indigestion. Historians still argue whether these adjuncts improved mead or just left curious flavors in pilgrims' mouths. You tuck the scroll into your belt, already envisioning future tastings that double as herbal therapy. As you make your way back toward the stair, the cellar's torchlight flickers along rough-hewn beams, casting dancing shadows across barrels lined like soldiers. You pause to press your palm against a cool oak stave, feeling the faint pulse of fermentation inside an invisible dance of yeast, feasting on berries and honey. You realize that this artful process, recorded and refined over centuries, bridged science and faith in every measure. In every barrel lies a promise that sour berries become liquid warmth to fortify monks and pilgrims alike. You climb the steps back to the scriptorium shoulders, humming with the cellar's chill. The world above seems brighter, almost garish after the hushed dusk of fermentation. Yet you carry with you the memory of that primal fizz, the taste of first-run mead, and the secret steps monks employed to craft it. Tomorrow, you'll note down the final yields and add a new doodle to the margins, perhaps a dancing yeast cell with a jaunty cap. After all, even the sacred art of fermentation deserves a wink. You step away from the scriptorium and make your way to the cloister walkway, where a carved wooden calendar wheel hangs against sun-darkened stone. The year rotates through seasons before you painted in vivid stripes of mustard jade and burnt sienna. Months are marked not by January or February, but by feasts Ostara for spring midsummer, for bloom, Michaelmas for harvest, and before the winter's hush, St. Lucy's fast. You trace your finger over the carved symbols, a blossom for May, a sheaf of grain for August, a snowflake for December. A mainstream historical fact anchors you here. Many medieval monasteries used liturgical calendars to time agricultural tasks, aligning berry harvests with saints' days to integrate work into worship. This calendar is more than decoration. It's the monastery's seasonal scheduler, a medieval weather app that never asks for a password. Fringe lore suggests that some monks hung fresh berry garlands on the calendar's spokes to invoke fertility for the next cycle, though historians still argue whether these garlands were religious offerings or just a sneaky snack left for novices. You wander toward a stone ledge and rest the carved wheel against your hip, inhaling the scent of sweet grass braided around a pillar. A light joke tickles your thoughts. You imagine texting the calendar a reminder. Hey, don't forget to bloom, and chuckle at the absurdity. The walk to the garden feels longer as you pass under vaults that echo with monks rehearsing Latin hymns. It's easy to picture them lip-syncing Berry Boy Wonderland if they had a medieval remix of Christmas carols. Outside, the orchard reveals its seasonal metamorphosis, emerald buds unfurling into pale flowers, green fruit swelling to glossy orbs, and shriveled skins clinging after crisp autumn snows. You wander between rows, noting slender stakes where chalk tallies were blotted by rain. A wooden placard reads, April 30th, elder blossoms lush, harvest 2 days hence. You scribble a note in your own ledger, stereotypical modern habit, wondering if the monks would appreciate your sticky post-its. As mid-May nears, you observe shifting yields. Early raspberries trickle in small quantities, while elderberries swell in abundance by Corpus Christi. A mainstream historical fact feast calendars, guided tasks like berry-picking fish, pond draining, and herb gathering, ensuring monastic labor wove seamlessly into liturgical rhythms. This blend of prayer and work embodies Saint Benedict's rule, anchoring piety in practical toil. Of fringe detail leaps out legend holds that monks believed harvesting elderberries on a Sunday morning yielded more potent mead, infused by divine sweetness. Historians still debate whether this belief shaped actual practices or was simply a story to amuse gate visitors. Your footsteps crunch over fallen petals as you approach a bench inscribed with runes marking seasons. When the cuckoo calls thrice, blackberry season is nigh. You settle there, brushing petals from your robe, and watch a robin flit through branches, chest puffed, throat wobbling. You whisper that if this garden had a Twitter, it would tweet climate updates. Now, berry bloom elderflower at 45% petal drop. Blackberry at 30% plumpness. A second light joke drifts through you. Imagine hashtags quill etched into vellum. Turning to a stone wall, you spot tiny carved notches. Each marks a bountiful year, 2 decades worth, crowding the rock's face. You glide your finger along the grooves, feeling hollow indentations like a tactile timeline. A mainstream historical fact, some abbeys recorded annual yields on stone or wood as public memorials of prosperity. Through plagues, wars, and climate shifts, of fringe snippets, whispers, rumor claims one abbey engraved a notch for each flask of mead, traded to Viking merchants blending spiritual record with trade bragging. Historians still argue whether these were pious mementos or commercial tallies. As July's heat floods the orchard, you lift an unripe green berry and taste its tang, wincing at memories of sweet mead fizziness. You note the precise hue, deep purple at peak ripeness crimson, when just past. These visual cues guide harvesters, a medieval ripeness app, flashing now ripe without batteries. You grin at the thought of a scribe doodling a smartphone with a quill. In a nearby shed, sacks of dried berries sit labeled by seasoned summer 1036, autumn 1037, each tied with colored seals, yellow for health, gray for frost risk, black for drought. A mainstream fact, color-coded seals helped monks swiftly sort produce for use, trade, or storage, an early form of inventory control. Fringe lore suggests they painted seals with herbal pigments that glowed under moonlight. Historians still debate whether these were primitive luminescent experiments or simply moonlit gossip. You tiptoe between barrel racks and spy spring-sealed casks. The aroma here is fresher, a young mead, still effervescent from recent fermentation. You lean in, swirling a sample in a wooden cup, as though judging at a royal banquet. A third light joke surfaces. You'd post a selfie captioned, "Just chilling with my BFFs, briny ferment friends." As dusk shadows stretch, you return to the calendar wheel. The painted month shifts from green blossoms to golden spheres, a seamless mark of the orchard's pulse. You brush your palm along the carved groove for harvest ember days, sensing centuries of fingertips pressing the same spot. In that moment, you're tethered across time, a chain of observers joined by seasons of bloom and harvest. You gather with the brothers to plan next year's tasks, mapping with charcoal on fresh parchment. The hush hums with ritual planning recording, predicting a tapestry blending devotion, labor, and berries. You shoulder centuries' weight, yet it feels lighter than a basket of fresh picks. You step out of the cloister's planning nook and make your way to the great barn, where carts stand ready beneath low beams, honeyed by candlelight. A sweet tang lingers in the air, leftover notes of yesterday's barrel tapping, and you almost expect that doodled, smiling berry to wink from a corner beam. Today is market day, when surplus fermented berries and mead barrels leave the monastery walls and roll toward town. You hop onto a wagon's bench beside Brother Leofric, who steers 2 steady oxen with calm patience. The wooden wheels creak in time with the beast's hoofs, and the scent of musty hay mingles with oak-aged mead. Outside these walls, your ledger entries transform into coin favors and even parish tithes. By the 11th century, monastic houses had become major economic hubs, trading surplus produce including mead and dried berries, with nearby towns and patrons, a mainstream historical fact, chronicled in medieval cartularies. You watch as a merchant in a patched woolen cloak approaches, slate tablet in hand, ready to record the exchange. 5 barrels of blackberry mead for 3 sacks of wheat flour, plus a silver penny for tolls. Brother Leofric drops the leather straps, and the merchant nods before scrawling the deal. You lean forward, imagining that ledger margin once again, spotting a tiny cart doodle beneath the numbers, a call back you can't resist smiling at. Your tongue ticks against your teeth as you taste the faint residue of mead on the wagon bench, a relic of last night's sampling. A light joke surfaces. If this were a modern rideshare, you'd rate it 5 stars for ambient oak aroma, but deduct 1 star for occasional medieval horse snorts. You lean out, catching a glimpse of the sprawling market beyond the drawbridge stalls, piled high with salted fish bolts of linen and wooden toys meant to amuse noble children. In the center, a raised platform hosts negotiations between abbots and city officials. Today's sermon is in commerce. A curt-clipped voice calls for attention. Abbot Wulfstan emerges, robes rustling like silk despite their heft. He carries a scroll listing parish tithe, owed 1/10 of surplus mead, dried fruits, and even honeycombs, must be delivered to the diocesan seat. You recall the head scribe's flourish when he wrote decimatio in ruby red ink, a vivid splash against the ledger's muted tones. As he steps forward, the market hushes out of respect. His presence commands the same deference as any bishop. Brother Leofric guides you toward a stack of barrels marked for tithe. Each bears a wax seal stamped with the bishop's crozier, a sign that these barrels will fill treasuries and perhaps supply feast halls for high-ranking clergy. You press your palm to a barrel's cool staves and feel the faint pulse of fermented life within, as though the spirit of every berry still hums under its wax plug. A fringed tidbit pokes at your curiosity. Rumor says that some abbeys disguise tithes as holy water shipments to avoid banditry, swapping labels at the last moment. Historians still argue whether this subterfuge was widespread or merely the boast of one creative cellarman. The crowds part as Abbot Wulfstan raises a hand and he intones, for our diocese, 1 barrel of elderberry mead and 2 of blackberry must pass the bishop's toll. His voice is calm, laced with just enough gravitas to hush whispers. You glance at the merchant scribbling furiously. His quill seems to dance, yet not nearly as artfully as in the scriptorium. You stifle a grin at the thought of those quills meeting a barrel bung instead of parchment. Nearby, a choir of novices carries smaller casks brimming with flavored mead, herb-infused batches meant as gifts for visiting dignitaries. You remember the rosemary and mint scroll from the cellar, and you nudge a novice to sniff a cask's rim. He inhales deeply, eyes widening as floral notes tickle his senses. A light joke slips out. This is medieval mead latte, you whisper, but hold the foam art. He giggles, then carefully secures the cask for transport. The abbot nods at you, and you approach with pen and tablet ready. He points to a faded bench where deals are recorded. Today's tithes are tallied alongside previous years, creating a ledger of loyalty and obligation. You dip your quill into ink, smelling that familiar oak, gall tang, and inscribe Anno 1042 Decimatio complete. Your fingers glide across vellum, recalling the ruled lines you studied in the scriptorium. A light joke tugs at your lips. You'd love a modern autopay feature for tithe set and forget until Judgment Day. Once the tithe is confirmed, a porter leads you and the abbot beneath the drawbridge gates into the bishop's quarter. Here, tapestries depict saints harvesting grapes and berries, their halos made of gilded vines. You feel the contrast between the monastery's stoic stone and the bishop's lush chambers. The pungent scent of incense drifts through corridors, mingling oddly with lingering mead aroma. A fringe rumor whispers that in one diocese, bishops commissioned illuminated manuscripts showing monks offering mead as a divine substitute for wine. Historians still argue whether these manuscripts were genuine liturgical tools or clever marketing for monastic brews. You enter a vaulted hall where clerks tally the incoming tithes on long wooden tables. Each barrel is weighed and its residual liquid tested for sugar content, a rudimentary QA for ecclesiastical revenues. You watch as a clerk taps a barrel. Bung lets a trickle dribble into a small cup and swirls it before sniffing. The color is deep amethyst, the bouquet robust, a silent compliment to the monastery's skill. You lean against a stone column, recalling that masthead doodle of the jaunty barrel back in the scriptorium, another playful nod across spaces. As the final cask is measured, a clerk hands Abbot Wulfstan a parchment receipt sealed with red wax. He breaks the seal, glances at the inked thanks of the bishop, and tucks the receipt into his robe. You salute the moment stripped of flourishes. The receipt embodies clarity thanks in black ink and seal. A mainstream historical fact, medieval tithing receipts served not only as proof of payment, but also as legal protection against later disputes. You tap your foot at the speed of medieval bureaucracy, efficient enough to avoid famine, slow enough to nurture anticipation. Outside, the market stalls resume their bustle, and you watch as merchants trade tokens carved from bone or lead early currency substitutes when coin ran scarce. A light joke springs to mind. If only these tokens had QR codes, you'd never worry about weight-to-value conversions. You help load one last barrel onto a porter's cart, then take a final breath of the heady mead-laden air. As the sun sinks low, you slip back through the barn's wooden door, leaving the bishop's quarter behind. You reflect on how a simple berry plucked from the garden rippled through ledger margins, trade deals, and lofty tithe halls, all because scribes noted each scoop, each barrel, each drop. You pat the acorn inkwell at your belt, feeling its weight and remembering that strange lunar superstition. The day's ledger is complete surplus turned to sustaining gold devotion sown into commerce, and even the driest numbers dancing with life. You tuck your quill away and head toward the gate, already plotting tomorrow's entries, and perhaps another barrel doodle in the margin. You slip through a narrow corridor, off the scriptorium, into the monastery's infirmary wing, where the air is thick with the scent of dried herbs and honey-sweet syrups steeping in earthenware crocks. Shelves carved into the stone walls groan under a patchwork of glass vials, wooden boxes, and leather-bound notebooks, each labeled in faded ink with cursive script: elderberry decoction, mead honey lozenge, rosehip infusion for fevers. A thin shaft of light from a high window glints off a copper ladle and you almost expect it to sing if you stirred it just right. You lean in to read a side note, penned in cramped handwriting. For coughs that wake the dead, add a pinch of ground nutmeg. You feel your throat tingle at the thought. Medieval medicine has never sounded so deliciously dangerous. By the 12th century, Benedictine monasteries housed Herbal's collections of plant remedies compiled from classical texts and oral lore, a mainstream historical fact that underscores monks' dual roles as spiritual shepherds and community healers. You brush a hand over a shelf labeled cough remedies and spot a small jar of crushed elderberries mixed with mead and honey. A quirky tidbit leaps out, rumor has it, that some infirmarians stirred their syrups under a waxing moon to capture the star's vitality. Though historians still argue whether lunar timing had any biochemical impact or was simply poetic flourish. You pour a shallow pool of amber syrup into a wooden bowl and swirl it with the copper ladle. The aroma is a heady mix of sweet honey and tangy berry acid, with a whisper of clove drifting in from a nearby mortar. A light joke tickles your lips. This would be a hit on any modern wellness blog. Elderberry Elixir Man V. Cough Season 1042 edition. You dip a finger, taste the syrup, and wince at the bold tang that puckers your cheeks like a sour lemon candy. A stone basin sits beneath a shelf loaded with parchment scrolls. You unroll one and find detailed recipes. Combine 1 sextarius elderberry mead with half a sextarius boiled chicory root. Simmer 6 hours. Strain through linen. Another margin note adds, test on ailing lamb before human trials. You wince at the notion of livestock trials and quip silently medieval QI definitely lacked modern ethics review boards. A second light joke surfaces. You wouldn't want your next cough syrup to come with BAD side effects. Across the room, Brother Gundolf stands beside a hearth where a bronze cauldron simmers with pale yellow liquid. He ladles out a sample of rosehip and mead infusion and presses it into your cupped hand. Its warmth spreads across your skin, carrying the tart fragrance of wild rose and the faint metallic tang of berries. Of fringe detail, some monks believed rose hips picked at dawn held stronger blood-cleansing properties, though historians still debate whether harvesting time truly altered vitamin content or simply heightened dramatic ritual. You settle onto a wooden stool, admire the smooth curve of the cauldron's rim, and watch steam curl into lazy spirals above your head. The infirmary walls are hung with dried bundles of meadow-sweet mint and valerian, their leaf crunch rustle echoing whenever someone enters. A mainstream historical fact meadowsweet known as the royal herb was prized for its fever-reducing salicylates, ancient precursors to aspirin, highlighting monks' sophisticated grasp of natural pharmacology. You sniff a bundle and wrinkle your nose. Flowers are lovely until you sneeze them back out. Brother Gundolf retrieves a small mortar and pestle, crushing yellow mustard seeds into a fine powder. He instructs you to mix 1 pinch with honeyberry syrup for chest-clearing plasters, sticky packs applied to the sternum to draw out congestion. You hesitate, picturing gooey mustard under your robe, and he offers a conspiratorial grin. A third light joke flits through your mind. If only they'd developed mustard-flavored cough drops instead of sticking it on our chests. You dip a linen strip into the syrup, roll it between 2 fingers. and place it against your forearm to gauge warmth. The plaster glows like amber in the dim light, and you hold it there, feeling the slow creep of heat. A fringe rumor whispers that some infirmarians added crushed garlic to these plasters to scare away evil humors, though historians still argue whether garlic's antiseptic qualities informed this practice or if it simply masked sour odors in crowded infirmaries. Nearby, a battered ledger lies open on a slanted desk, each entry showing batch numbers of medicinal brews alongside yield figures. You spot batch 27 rosehip infusion 9 pints, batch 28 elderberry decoction 12 pints, batch 29 fever fighting mead 7 pints. Small crosses mark batches found ineffective, and a tiny doodle of a snoring monk indicates which brew induced restful sleep. You grin at the callback marginalia once again, breathing life into sterile data. You stand and wander to a wooden work table strewn with thick parchment pages covered in abbreviations EBDRIF FM codes to preserve secrecy, perhaps to prevent lay people from replicating these potent remedies. A pannier basket lies open, revealing ingredients, currants, hawthorn berries, wild mint, and a vial of saffron thread so fine they float like golden hairs. You pinch a thread between thumb and forefinger. Its aroma is shockingly vibrant, floral, and honeyed. A light joke baubles up saffron probably costs more per gram than all the mead in this cellar combined. It's clear that even in austerity, monks indulged in luxury. A wooden stool bears a carved groove, its seat worn smooth from countless sitters. A slender monk drapes a hood over his head and begins to document today's recipe refinements. FM, pluses MI, guess improved restorative properties. You peek over his shoulder, mix fever-fighting mead with mint infusion, allowed to settle one day. A mainstream historical fact emerges. Medieval brewers often combined herbs and honey with fermentation to enhance both flavor and therapeutic effect. A practice echoed centuries later in modern functional kombucha blends. You feel a gentle buzz in your temples, an almost narcotic haze from inhaling steam laced with herbal oils. The infirmary's hush wraps around you like velvet, punctuated by the soft hiss of simmering syrups and the gentle click of wooden boxes closing. You imagine posting this scene on a 12th century ASMR channel, monastic medicine grinding and simmering with millions of views guaranteed among allergy sufferers and insomniacs alike. Finishing your tour, you gather a small jar of fever-fighting mead, its wax-sealed lid still warm to the touch. You tuck it into your robe pocket, mindful of its weight and promise. Before you leave, you pause at the shelf and whisper, thanks to the scribes who recorded these recipes, people who turned plucked berries into liquid comfort for bodies and souls alike. Stepping back into the corridor, you blot a bead of syrup from your finger on the stone wall and taste its sweet tart edge once more. You carry these recipes forward, knowing that each measured pint, each careful note, and each whispered, doodle-stitched craft care and a touch of whimsy into medieval medicine. Tomorrow, the ledger will chronicle new tweaks, perhaps a dash of lavender for dreams, or another sketch to bless the brew. You slip back into the scriptorium, the familiar tang of oak gall ink greeting you like a friend you haven't seen since dawn. Candlelight pools in warm circles on the long wooden table where ledgers lie open, pages curled at the edges from years of handling. The hush here is punctuated by soft murmurs, Brother Osric and Brother Wulfric debating in low voices over ink-smudged margins. You weave between desks, catching the faint scent of fermented berry mead still clinging to the corner page from yesterday's tally. Its market day glow mixed with parchment dust and odd perfume that tells you you're in the right place. Before you lies a hefty folio, its spine cracked from constant opening. Margin notes in different hands jog your memory of that smiling berry doodle and the tiny barrel sketch here, though the flourishes have turned pointed. One brother has scribbled Era 503 beside a blackberry yield, while another has crossed that correction out and scrawled See account of elder mash. You peer closer, the ink shifts from purple-black to rusty red, a visual echo of ecclesiastical corrections, a mainstream historical fact. Surfaces medieval monastic chapters often held annual audits, sometimes called visits of correction, to reconcile accounts and ensure no brother grew too fond of private profits. You lean over the desk, tracing a jagged arrow linking a disputed entry to a note. Brother Osric's account hides tonic sale. A fringed tidbit emerges. Rumor says that Osric once sold a keg of elderberry mead to a traveling minstrel at night, pocketing the coins for a secret feast, though historians still argue whether this tale comes from genuine whispers or a late ascribed satire. You tilt your head and imagine a gallery of invisible ears eavesdropping on candle-lit confessions. The flame of a nearby candle flickers, and you catch the warmth on your cheek. You sense the tension crackling in the air like static before a storm of ink. Wulfric adjusts his quill holster, the leather creaking, and raps his knuckles on the desk in a silent drum roll. He argues that the pound weights were misaligned, not Osric's fault. You lean in, hearing the whisper-quiet rasp of quill on parchment as Osric counters with a margin note, scale faulty since thorn scratch. You stifle a laugh. This is medieval office politics minus the swivel chairs. A light joke drifts through your mind. You'd love a medieval memo tracker app. Brother Wulfric replied to your error note at third vespers. Instead, you have marginalia and scratched out ink as your notification ping. The candle sputters, and you catch a wisp of smoke, inhaling the acrid warmth like a low-volume incense. You sense the gravity of these debates. Each disputed berry count could affect the abbey's trade revenues, the parish tithes, even the alms for the poor. You step aside as Abbot Emmerich enters his robes, whispering against stone. He glides to the center table, silver crozier in hand, and studies the contested page with a scholar's gaze. Under his scrutiny, the margins fall silent. You watch his eyes trace the red corrections, the scribbles that accuse and defend. A mainstream historical fact glints here. Many abbots were trained in canon law, giving them authority to adjudicate internal disputes and enforce economic fairness. Emmerich's presence hushes the room like a finger over a harp's string. He leans forward, and you catch the soft clink of inkpot on desk. Then, in a voice as calm as a moonlit pond, he pronounces that the scale's calibration in the cellar must be verified before passing judgment on Osric's numbers. A fringe detail tickles your senses. Some monks claimed that the cellar scale was gifted by Norse traders and cursed to shift measurements unless appeased with prayers to Thor, though historians still debate whether this was a genuine belief or simple scapegoating for missing yields. You watch Osric bow his head, relief flickering in his eyes, and Wulfric exhale, tension leaving his shoulders. The room seems to expand, the hush deepens, and you become acutely aware of the scratch of quills, the soft tap of a stylus marking an updated instruction, reweigh all blackberry batches. A light joke darts through your mind. If only they'd outsourced calibration to a professional metrologist, though you suspect the medieval version probably wore sandals and swore in Latin. You drift toward the far wall where ledgers detailing profit-sharing agreements are displayed. Ink columns list cellar steward and harvest master, with percentages carved beside each name. You run your finger down the numbers, 20% to the infirmary fund, 30% to the scriptorium projects, and the rest earmarked for roof repairs and alms. A mainstream historical fact surfaces many monastic communities allocated surplus according to predetermined ratios, linking economic success to communal welfare, a system that balanced spiritual mission with material maintenance. A marginal note in fine cursive alerts you, revisit ratio after frost of 1040. You recall the frost marker in the garden, the one etched into stone that commemorated a blighted blackberry season. Now you see how environmental shocks fed back into ledger debates adjusting profit shares when yields plunged. A fringe rumor whispers that one overly ambitious steward once tried to claim a larger share by disguising frost-damaged berries with dye, and historians still argue whether that scandal ever extended beyond local gossip or triggered a wider reform. You shiver at the thought and tuck your robe around you. The candlelight stretches across the barn beam ceiling, illuminating the pale lead lines on the parchment. You become absorbed by the interplay of ink hues, black for official entries, red for corrections, faint gray for tentative calculations. Between them, tiny symbols, asterisk, cross, flourish, serve as shorthand reminders. See audit note. Question, this approved. You feel like you're reading a medieval spreadsheet, each cell a battleground, where conscience met commerce. You approach a slender desk where a junior scribe taps a stylus against a small wax tablet testing proposed changes. He murmurs, perhaps add a footnote on tithes to clarify confusion. A light joke surfaces. Medieval footnotes would make modern footnotes blush. They probably had more drama and fewer abbreviations. You hear the soft whisper of wax ribbons unraveling as he peels off a thin sheet to document the amendment. As you stand there, the rhythmic scratching of quills becomes a lullaby. Numbers dancing into place, corrections finding resolution. The room breathes with centuries of human doubt and careful reconciliation. You remember the acorn ink well from dawn, now empty, but for a few stubborn droplets, and sense that each drop once inked these very debates. The monk's diligence ensured that nothing, no missing berry, no mismeasured pint, could disrupt the balance between spirituality and sustenance. Emmerich finally lifts his crozier and moves toward the doorway, signaling the end of this chapter's audit. The scribes lower their quills, and the room's murmur dissolves into reverent silence. You inhale, the layered scents, ink, berry residue, candle smoke, as though tasting each contested digit. A light joke flutters you'd love to slip a modern calculator onto the table and watch everyone gape at the flashing numbers, though you'd miss the artistry of these handwritten disputes. As you step away, you glance back at the margin where Osric's correction once stood, bold and red. A tiny drawing of a balance scale now sits beside it, drawn by an unknown hand, another emblem of the ledger's living pulse. You smile, knowing that every scribble, every debate, every margin doodled threads through time to shape the monastery's economy. Tomorrow, you'll revisit those blackberries, reweighed, recounted, and perhaps redoodled, keeping faith that even dry numbers can carry a heartbeat. You slip into the refectory just after Vespers, where long wooden benches flank a central table strewn with platters of coarse bread bowls of watery stew and clay jugs of pale mead. The air is cool and tinged with the tang of fermented berries, a scent that promises comfort in a time of enforced austerity. Candle flames gutter softly along the walls, casting mellow amber pools on bowed heads and discussed grievances over incomplete fasts. You take in the scene, a monastic meal laid out for Lent, frugal, yet scented with sour, sweet promise. By the 13th century, the rule of St. Benedict strictly forbade meat and dairy during Lent, allowing only fish pulse and simple gruel, yet many monasteries encouraged the use of fermented beverages to warm bones and lift spirits, a mainstream historical fact recorded in Abbey Chronicles. You spot Brother Cuthbert humming as he dips his wooden bowl into a thin barley broth spiced with vinegar, called posca by the Romans, and revived here as a fasting staple. Next to him, Brother Simeon nibbles a crust smeared with a thin layer of crushed elderberry paste, believing it counts as medicine rather than food. A fringed tidbit drifts through your mind. Rumor claims that some monks considered berry mash liquid penance, though historians still argue whether these practices genuinely eased hunger or simply skirted the letter of the law. You settle onto a stool at the end of the table, and a novice ladles a portion of nettle soup into your bowl. You taste the green bitterness, then chase it with a sip of mead diluted with water, its faint fizz tickling the back of your throat. A light joke flits through your thoughts. If medieval mead had carbonation marketing, they'd brag now with 2% more tickle per pint. You lean forward, feeling the wooden tables grain under your palms, and watch a brother drizzle a handful of fermented currants into a porridge of oats and water, turning drab gruel into something almost festive. Fasting in these walls often led to culinary creativity. Driven by necessity, monks mastered the art of stretching scarce resources, turning barley pulses and fermented berries into surprisingly hearty dishes. You recall the acorn inkwell's humble ingenuity. Now you see culinary parallels in resourceful substitutions. A second light joke drifts by. You'd compare this to modern plant-based diets, except here they called it survival-based and forgot the hashtags. Across the table, Brother Alcuin whispers to Brother Benedict, pointing at a battered pot labeled Lenten Compote. He scoops a spoonful into his bowl. The compote is a mash of simmered blackberries and vinegar, thick and slightly sour. You dip your spoon and taste its deep bruise-like tang, the vinegar cutting through the sweetness. a quirky detail emerges. Tradition says that compote served on Ash Wednesday energized monks for the first rigorous fast day, symbolizing both ashes and new life. You smirk as you imagine Ash Wednesday blackberry brulee trending at a medieval cafe. A third light joke surfaces. You check TripAdvisor, but the only rating here is a prayer for forgiveness if you overindulge. You glance around at the nearly barren platters, empty wooden boards where fish once lay, bowls scraped clean of pulse, and jugs of spring water thick with pale mead must. A novice squeezes a small lemon into a bowl of thin rye gruel, murmuring that citrus helps ward off scurvy and also makes Lent almost palatable. You nod, recalling the infirmary's rosehip infusions that were meant to cure fevers, and you wonder if anyone ever combined hawthorn berries with gruel to boost flavor. As you lift your gaze, the candlelight highlights a ledger propped against a corner beam, listing weekly fasting deviations marked with a small cross. Today's entry reads, Brother Theobald consumed 2 cups of elderberry mead at midday, citing medicinal necessity. You imagine the head scribe's quill dancing across the page to make that note sprinkled with just enough disapproval. A callback shimmers. That same scribble of a smiling berry you saw yesterday now adorns the refectory ledger, perhaps to soften the judgment. You chuckle, picturing the berry winking at Theobald's transgression. A soft murmur rises as Brother Prior walks the line eyes, scanning bowls and jugs. When he stops before you, you feel your pulse quicken. Will he condemn you for that extra sip of dilute mead? Instead, he dips his thumb into the compote pot and tastes a drop, nodding with approval. You exhale, feeling a rush of relief that tastes sweeter than any feast. A light joke drifts through. You'd write a medieval Yelp review, asking for 1 free compote sample, please. Beyond the prior, a choir of novices moves in silent procession, collecting empty bowls and depositing them at a stone trough. You rise and follow, balancing your scraps, half a crust, a spoonful of nettle soup, and a clay cup holding a final spoonful of berry-infused gruel. You push your bowl forward, feeling its weight lessen, a shared act of communal humility. As you hand over your scraps, you notice faint lines carved into the trough's rim, tiny notches, tracking how often each dish was sampled. A mainstream historical fact emerges. Monasteries often recorded consumption rates to plan provisions, ensuring no brother went hungry during long fasts. You step away from the trough and lean against a pillar, scarred with centuries of hands gripping for support. A breeze drifts through an open window slit, carrying the mixed aromas of barley, nettles, and fermented berries. You close your eyes and picture that frosted garden marker, how frost faltered yields, once altering ration sizes for Lenten feasts. Monks would gather in the refectory afterwards, lamenting lean pickings, yet celebrating solidarity. That memory knits together orchard yields and communal meals in a seamless tapestry. The prior's voice calls you back to your bench, reminding you that the next vigils will begin soon, and that any deviation from the fast must be recorded with explanation. You sit, feeling a gentle ache in your shoulders from the wooden stool, and watch as Brother Simeon scrawls today's medical exemptions into the refectory ledger. A fringe rumor surfaces. Some infirmarians issued berry binge permissions to stave off fainting spells, though Historians still argue whether these dispensations prioritize welfare or indulgence. You pop a single dried elderberry into your mouth, letting its tartness blossom across your tongue. It's a tiny, rebellious act, a final flourish of flavor in a world defined by restraint. A soft joke warms your chest. You'd call this cheat day medieval style, were it not for the silent judgment written in red ink beside the spilled compote note. At last you stand and gather your empty bowl and cup. You glance one last time at the small ledger, that winking berry doodle, and the scrawled notes dictating who fasted too well or too poorly. In this quiet hall, you sense the tension between devotion and humanity, the monks' vow of poverty and their enduring love for berries, that taste of sunlight and soil. With a respectful nod to the wooden benches and candle-swept table, you slip out carrying the memory of frugal feasts fasting fails, and the stubborn spark of fermented berry spirit that kept pale Lent meals from feeling utterly bleak. You descend once more into the archives chamber, where the hush of stone walls is punctuated only by the soft scrape of your sandals and the distant drip of melting icicles. Candlelight pools over oak shelves heavy with fat folios, each ledger lined with neat columns of berry yields and punctuated by the occasional doodle, a grinning barrel here, a winking berry there. A gust of cold air sneaks in through a narrow window, carrying with it whispers of trouble beyond these walls, rumors of longships carving insidious silhouettes against northern skies. You settle at a low desk strewn with parchment scraps, your fingertips grazing the familiar acorn inkwell beside you. Tonight, you're here to chart not only pints and pounds, but the upheavals that shape those numbers, Viking raids, volcanic winters, and fickle weather that turned orchards into battlegrounds of survival. By the late 8th century, Viking longships began prowling coasts from Scotland to Francia, targeting monasteries for their riches, a mainstream historical fact chronicled in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Irish annals alike. You imagine those sleek wooden dragons slipping up rivers under moonlight axes glinting and hushed curses trailing behind. In your mind's eye, you see monks clutching their ledgers as raiders storm in ledger sheets, catching gusts of wind like distressed gulls. The clatter of quills falls silent as shields splinter outside. A fringed tidbit flits through your thoughts. Legend says some cloisters hid their barrels of mead beneath false floors, believing that Viking raiders were deterred if they found only worthless water barrels. Though historians still argue whether this ploy ever succeeded, or if the story was merely a later invention to glorify monastic cunning. Across the open folio, before you yield entries for the year 793, read blackberry 15 pints, elderberry 9 pints, followed by a shaky marginal note, raid at Lindisfarne, drained stores loss unknown. The handwriting shifts from the steady hand of Brother Wulfstan to the hurried script of a visiting monk, its jagged loops echoing the chaos outside. You lean closer, sensing tension in every scratch of the quill. You recall the frost marker of Anno Domini 1032 carved in the garden, and now you see how human raids could mark a ledger just as permanently as climate. A light joke drifts through your mind. If only the ledger had columns for raiders diverted by strategic mead tasting, you'd see far more entries noted in victory. You trace a thin line linking the raid note to a later correction. See conversion note on page 112. A small arrow drawn in red ink guides you there. You glide your finger along the margin, feeling the slight ridge where the ruling pen left its mark. The conversion table lists 1 Libra berry yield equals 2 Sexteria mid-release, yet the next line is crossed out with a furious flourish annotated, rats feasted on mash adjust ratio. That quirky detail reminds you that some losses were less dramatic than Viking axes and more prosaic rodents raiding the mash tub under cover of darkness. Historians still debate whether rats caused more yield loss than marauding armies, or if storytellers simply amplified their role for comic relief. A sudden chill drifts through the chamber as you open another ledger, this one dated 536. The entries are sparser, the yields, pitiful blackberry 3 pints, elderberry 1 pint, below a broad heavy stroke, and then the single word, famine. You swallow. In 536, a massive volcanic eruption blanketed Europe in soot, plunging the world into darkness and cold, a mainstream historical fact affirmed by tree-ring studies and written accounts like those of Procopius. You can almost taste the endless gloom that followed frozen orchards, withered vines, and hungry monks huddled around empty barrels. You press your palm to the page, feeling the ghost of desperate prayers inked into those scant lines. Next to the famine note, a tiny doodle appears, an overturned bucket spilling black dots like falling stars. That fringe scribble seems less whimsical and more mournful here, a silent lament that even creativity couldn't banish the sorrow of ruined harvests. Historians still argue whether that 536 darkness event cut berry yields for a decade, or if monastic gardening adaptations like greenhouse linen frames mitigated the worst impacts. You sigh remembering the greenhouse you visited in Section 2. Its steamy interior cradling gooseberry shoots against winter's bite. Your quill hovers over an empty margin, and you consider jotting a note. Frost marker and raider notes suggest overlapping crises necessitating new yield projections. But instead, you lean back and listen to the muted symphony of dripping wax and distant wind. The very act of recording these numbers feels like a defiance of chaos, each entry a small victory over forces beyond human control. A light joke flutters you'd tag these entries on social media with medieval climate change, though you'd likely baffle followers with your acorn inkwell selfies. As you flip to a later page, somewhere around Anno Domini 1000, you find a seasonal chart overlaying yield data with astronomical notes. Harvest began 3 days after lunar eclipse. A mainstream historical fact, solar and lunar eclipses were meticulously noted by monks who believed celestial events influenced earthly fortunes. Yet you spot a marginal scrawl, eclipse feared to poison vines. Yields proved unaffected. This fringe tidbit highlights how scientific observation slowly tempered superstition, even as some still argued whether eclipses merely made pretty night shows or held real agricultural sway. You reach for the conversion table, that faithful piece of parchment pinned under wax, and compare entries across decades. Yield ratios wobble like unsteady scales, 2-1 in bountiful years, sinking to 1-3 after raid frost seasons. You murmur the phrase, historians still argue whether monastic record keepers prioritize theological symbolism over empirical accuracy, appreciating how open that debate remains. You trace the fine nib of your quill across a note, consider adding barley husk counts to cross-check yields, You imagine the scribe who will inherit your annotation, perhaps rolling his eyes at your modern-minded suggestions. A low rumble echoes through the chamber, nothing more than the settling of heavy stones, yet it feels ominous, like the distant thunder of long ships at sea. You gather your parchments and tuck them under your arm, pausing at a tall shelf laden with sample jars. You inspect one marked year 845 post-Raider. Blend its contents a dark slurry of mixed berries and honey. You dip a finger, taste the tart sweet mash, and wince at its acrid edge, an unfiltered memory of survival. A light joke trails this taste like a furious Viking special. No wonder the raiders came looking for more. You rise and stretch, feeling the gentle ache of crouching over ledgers for hours. The cold from outside seems to recede as you stand by the doorway, candlelight warming your back. You glance back at the open pages, at the interplay of raids, famine frost, and yield figures that map centuries of struggle and ingenuity. You realize that these ledgers are more than agricultural records. They're human stories etched in ink, where every recovered pint signifies resilience. As you step into the night air, the wind carries you forward toward the vine-covered cloister. Snowflakes begin to drift, each a silent harbinger of another harvest season to come, another ledger page to fill. You pull your cloak tighter, savoring the sharp promise of winter berries waiting beneath the surface. In the hush, you can almost hear the scribe's quills scratching the monk's whispered prayers for fruitful springs and the distant crash of long ships fading into legend. You slip back into the scriptorium just after matins, the pale light through narrow windows casting long slanted beams across stacked ledgers and scattered quills. A hushed tension greets you, less from audit or raid, and more from the unspoken rivalry, humming between desks like static electricity. You drift past Brother Alcuin's bench, where his quill dances in broad, confident strokes, and peer over the shoulder of Brother Wulfric, whose lettering tightens in direct contrast. Their flourishes curl toward each other like dueling vines, each trying to outdo the other's penmanship in a contest invisible to most, but as real as any physical sparring match. You settle beside a column and cradle your quill ready to witness the art of colophons and covert jabs. At the foot of each ledger page, colophons serve as a scribe's signature and closing remark, a mainstream historical fact, found in countless medieval codices, where scribes noted their names, dates, even the weather, or their own exhaustion. Here those colophons snap closed pages like a final chapter seal. Brother Osric's reads, completed by the prompt hand of Osric the Steady on the feast of Saint Benedict, followed by a tidy knot of vine-like loops. Opposite it, Brother Cadful, teensy writes, may these berries never spoil sooner than my patience before signing Cadful, who would prefer gardening over guessing weights. You stifle a light joke. Imagine if modern office memos ended with, sent from my medieval ledger, apologies for wax stains. You lean in, catching the faint scent of oak gall ink and candle smoke, and spot a tiny smudge at the end of Cadful's line. It's no accident, rumor says he dipped his quill in pepper water to induce sneezing fits in rivals, leading to the occasional rogue blot. A fringed tidbit surfaces. Some monks believe that sprinkling a drop of vinegar on a rival's inkpot would turn their scribbles to brown sludge, though historians still argue whether the acidity ever achieved its intended sabotage or merely created extra vinegar stink in the cold stone halls. Your gaze shifts to the margin where a sly comment lurks beside a yield entry Brother Alcuin counts like he tastes always a little too much. Though penned in tiny brown ink, the jest stand out like a jester's cap among monks' cowls. You trace the delicate letter forms, each serif sharpened, as if carving the insult in miniature. You imagine that if they had slack, these two would PM each other passive-aggressive emojis, instead of carving them into vellum. Amid this quiet feud, you notice that each scribe's tools are as much a battleground as their words. Osric's quills are clipped to a uniform nib angle honed for crisp numerals. Wulfric's are left longer for sweeping capitals. You lean close to inspect the difference, the angle of the slit, the way light flickers along the razor-sharp edge. A mainstream historical fact emerges. Medieval scribes custom-cut quill nibs to suit their personal style, a practice taught in scriptorium apprenticeships across Europe. Those slight variations in cut meant each scribe left a fingerprint on the page, an entire personal brand written in feather and ink. You slide your gaze up to the top of the page where in smudged purple ink someone has drawn a tiny grinning berry, its mouth tilted in a mischievous smirk. It's the same doodle you've spotted elsewhere, but here it wears a little scribal cap. That quirky emblem seems to be the universal sign for scribe solidarity, or perhaps a shared conspiracy to lighten the monotony of columns and weights. Historians still argue whether this berry motif began as an inside joke among a single circle of brothers or sprang up organically across multiple monasteries as word of mouth spread. A sudden scratch of quill draws your attention to Brother Arnulf at the far end. He's working on a new colophon, and you watch as he glances surreptitiously at his neighbor's note before adding his own flourish, a tiny ladder beside his name, symbolizing his climb above the rest in penmanship prowess. A light joke flits through your mind. If corporate performance reviews had been this literal, you'd see annual ladder drawing quotas alongside sales targets. You step back and cradle your own quill, considering how to navigate this charged atmosphere. You recall the acorn inkwell cradled on the head scribe's desk, a humble vessel that hosted both solemn entries and scandalous jests. You dip into that familiar pool of purple-black ink, its viscosity primed by crushed oak galls, and let your nib kiss the parchment in gentle arcs. You record a fresh report, Section 12, Scribe Rivalries and Colophons. Across the table, Brother Osric glances up, eyebrow raised. He flicks a tiny dot of ink onto your margin, a peace offering, or a challenge, you can't tell. You smirk and return the favor, tucking your quill under your ear. A fringe detail drifts through your thoughts. Rumor claims that in some chapters, scribes intentionally erased rivals' colophons at night and replaced them with garbled script, though historians still argue whether this occurred in earnest or survived only in spirited bedtime tales. You rise and move toward a shelf lined with old ledgers whose colophons bear more personal notes. Brother Gervais hatched this on the day he lost a bet over fish pie Brother Benedict wrote through a toothache would not recommend. These candid footnotes leap from the stone shelf like whispers from the past, reminding you that behind every line of weight and yield lies a scribe with a pulse and a personality. You pause to read one that cracks you up. If you find this leaf-torn blame, Brother Matthew's cat, not my quill, signed with a tiny paw-print doodle. A light joke emerges. Corporate attorneys and cat victims everywhere would applaud this clear allocation of blame. You drift back to your station as the head scribe passes, eyes darting over colophon after colophon, approving some strokes and smoothing others with a stylus. You note his methodical rhythm. Tap the quill, scan the script nod. A mainstream historical fact resonates. Many head scribes read colophons aloud during chapter meetings to affirm accountability and acknowledge labor, turning personal notes into collective lore. You imagine the brothers squirming or grinning as their quirks were broadcast in hushed tones around the hall. As you settle into your bench, the soft scent of ink and candle soot envelops you. You let your eyes wander over the margins where cursive loops intertwine with vine motifs, tiny symbols, stars, crosses, even miniature animals crowd the space. Each marginal flourish is a covert call and response, a wink between writers across time. A final fringe tidbit surfaces. Some monks claim that those who could decipher every colophon puzzle would unlock a hidden recipe for blessed berry elixir, though historians still argue whether such a recipe ever existed beyond scribal fantasy. You lean back and trace a finger over your own colophon, still wet with ink, completed by your humble narrator who believes that even rivalry can be penned with kindness. You dip your quill in the acorn well for one last flourish, a tiny heart around your name, then stand admiring the tapestry of script that fills the room. The scribes around you pause, their rivalry set aside for a moment as they admire each other's handiwork. In that quiet exchange of glances, you sense a deeper bond that through every jest and jibe, these brothers share devotion to craft, to each other, and to the humble berry yields that give their lives purpose. You tuck your quill away and step toward the cupboard where fresh vellum waits. Tomorrow, these colophons will guide new scribes, carry whispered jokes forward, and remind future readers that behind every ledger lies the heartbeat of human creativity. With a final nod to the hushed scriptorium, you slip away, the echo of quill tips against parchment trailing behind you like a lullaby. You slip quietly back into the fermentation cellar, where wooden barrels huddle like secretive sentinels, and the air is pungent with honeyed berry fumes and cool oak. A single lantern swings overhead, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn beams. You run a fingertip along the rim of a fermenting vat, feeling its slight stick of sugar and yeast, an almost imperceptible hum of life lingering beneath the surface. Here, amid the hush, you confront the puzzles that scribes left unsolved, the why, how, and when of these fermented berry yields, all entangled in curious marginalia and half-erased entries. The first conundrum leaps out at you: inconsistent fermentation times. Some ledgers note elderberry mash 10 days to clear, while others record identical batches settling in just 5. A mainstream historical fact underpins this discrepancy. Medieval brewers often reused a portion of the previous batch's sediment, called yeast head or barm, to inoculate new fermentations, making each barrel's timeline unique to its lineage. You peek at a faded note in that ledger, Ruse lees from March batch for swifter fermentation, but below a question mark hovers. A fringe tidbit suggests that certain monks believed only lees harvested under a solar eclipse carried divine yeast, though historians still argue whether such celestial conditions truly influenced microbial vigor or served as poetic justification for unpredictable brews. You hover by a stack of small notebooks where scribes tried to standardize methods. One page lists berry mash ratio 3:1 water to fruit, while another claims 2:1 preferred for richer flavor. You can almost hear the scribes whispering in the candlelit scriptorium, "If we cook berries longer, must we add more water?" You bend in closer, reading a tiny margin note, tested, 2:1 yields too thin, back to 3:1. A light joke drifts through your mind. If only medieval brewers had a recipe blog, we'd have clear step-by-step instructions instead of cryptic doodles and crossed-out ratios. The second puzzle glares at you in the ledger's columns, conversion inconsistencies between weight and volume. 1 month's entry reads, Libra X yields Sextary 5. But 2 pages later, the same weight pairs with Sextary Pauf. You lift a brass weight from its hook, its surface pitted by time, and recall that a Libra's exact mass varied regionally anywhere from 320 to 340 grams. That's a mainstream historical fact. Local Libra standards depended on bishopric edicts and municipal decrees. You track the conversions and find they shift subtly when scribes note a new rule in the margin count pound as heavy Libra after frost, hinting that they adjusted weight standards to account for denser berries. A fringe rumor speculates that some abbots intentionally tweaked conversions to produce more mead for sale, though historians still argue whether these adjustments were honest calibrations or crafty schemes to boost revenue. Footnotes pepper your path. Fermentation closer to hearth warms by 3 degrees. Record yield separate. That entry puzzles you monks clearly recognize that temperature affected fermentation speed and flavor, yet no ledger consistently logs cellar versus scriptorium temperatures. A quirky detail leaps out. The legend claims that monks hung strips of wool in barrels to judge temperature by wool's dryness, but historians still debate whether wool could truly serve as an accurate thermometric proxy, or if it was simply a charming anecdote sketched by a bored scribe. You drift toward a long table where fragments of missing folios have been taped together. One nearly complete page lists juniper-treated mash under experimental batches. Curious, you lean in. Juniper was known for its preservative oils and piney flavor, yet the yield column is blank, and the notes column bears only a single symbol, a flower with 3 dots. A light joke surfaces. Someone must have eaten the yield before writing it down. Beneath that enigmatic doodle, another scribe wrote, results lost in raid of 10 or 21, merging 2 of your earlier puzzles, Viking chaos and record gaps. You murmur the open debate phrase. Historians still argue whether raid-related losses obliterated significant brewing knowledge, or if monastic communities quickly reconstructed methods from oral memory. You wander to a narrow ledge where parchment scraps record unusual fermentation vessels. Ashen urn, slight smoke note, limestone vat clarity improved. You taste the air as though sniffing pottery ash and imagine a smoky berry mead infused by campfire tang. A fringe tidbit teases you monks supposedly charred the interior of urns to enhance flavor, and stave off bacteria, yet historians still argue whether this was common practice or the invention of one experimental abbot with a taste for flambe. The third riddle hides in the scriptorium's back room. Who exactly recorded these methods? Some entries bear neat, flowing hands. Others are cramped scrawl. A mainstream historical fact, monasteries employed both choir scribes and lay brothers, with choir scribes trained in calligraphy and lay brethren often managing manual tasks, including brewing and harvesting. Yet none of the fermentation notes are signed, and the marginal references to trials seem to straddle both worlds. You flip a small wooden tablet that reads, Brother Elfric's test, but still no confirmation sealed with a colophon. A quirky item in the corner jerry echoes a single oak gall stamped property of Brother Simeon, hinting at individual ownership of ink and quill, which could explain discrepancies in style, but not the absence of names in method entries. Historians still argue whether communal anonymity was deliberate to emphasize collective effort, or if individual scribes simply opted to remain humble. You pause before a ledger bound in dark leather, its spine cracked and edges frayed. Inside, yield charts are overlaid with cryptic symbols instead of numbers, a coded shorthand you've never seen. You squint at a patterned circled triangles and crosses aligning with dates. A fringe rumor suggests these were the personal codes of a secret brotherhood of brew, safeguarding advanced fermentation knowledge from outside eyes. You smile at the notion like a medieval trade secret, though historians still debate whether such a brotherhood ever existed, or if these symbols were merely a scribe's elaborate doodles meant to pass time on long nights. A beam of moonlight slips through the cellar slit and illuminates a thin scroll pinned to the wall, Fermentation Q&A by Abbot Emmerich. Under a header, Questions Unanswered, he lists optimal mash pH, yeast longevity, beyond one season, impact of lunar phase. You trace each line feeling the abbot's frustration. A mainstream historical fact, while medieval brewers understood acidity's effect qualitatively, pH as a scientific concept wouldn't be measured until centuries later. You lean back and let a light joke slip. If only Abbot Emmerich had a modern pH meter, he'd have settled that first bullet before Matins. Beneath his questions, a single note reads, awaiting answer from Paris scholar, hinting at early scholarly correspondence, but the reply is nowhere to be found. Historians still argue whether such intermonastic networks shared brewing research, or whether logistics made such exchanges rare. Your eyes drift to a small alcove where broken ceramic hive stands hold fragments of pollen-laden combs. Next to them, a ledger entry reads, Test batch wildflower honey. The yield column is filled with slashes, unquantified experiments. A fringe anecdote whispers that monks believed wildflower honey imparted spiritual visions, a placebo effect more than a brewing protocol. You chuckle softly. That's one high you probably won't survive on just berries and honey. A second light joke dances. Maybe they needed those visions to decipher missing data. You step back and survey the room. Barrels, vats, ledgers, notebooks, jars, each holding clues and contradictions. You can almost hear the murmured debates across centuries, the scribes comparing notes, the abbots dispatching inquiries, and the monks experimenting in twilight hush. You sense the living pulse of unanswered questions, each one an invitation to future scholars to pore over stained pages and faded ink. You pocket your quill and glance once more at Abbot Emmerich's unanswered scroll. The cellar's hush holds its breath as if waiting for your own margin note answer still sought. You smile and tuck that note into your mind's ledger, knowing that tomorrow you might record new trials or discover another cryptic symbol. The puzzles remain, but so does the monastic spirit of inquiry, ever striving for clarity in the midst of fermented mystery. You slip through the low arch into the monastery's great hall, where ledgers rest in orderly stacks on a broad oak table, their vellum pages awash in mellow lamplight. The scent of beeswax and parchment curl around you like the echo of centuries, and you settle onto a carved bench, running your fingertips over the familiar acorn inkwell groove at the table's edge. Here you witness the final act in a centuries-long performance, how these berry yields, chiseled into margins and columns, would shape the future of agricultural accounting far beyond cloister walls. By the 15th century, monastic records' meticulous registers of harvests, weights, and volumes served as templates for emerging secular estate ledgers across Europe, a mainstream historical fact noted in studies of early agrarian management. Landowners and stewards borrowed the monks' format of dated entries, margin notes, and standardized units, transforming an ecclesiastical ritual into a practical tool for evaluating soil productivity, crop rotation, and tenant obligations. You can almost feel the grainy texture of these new estate books under your palm, like a parchment-born blueprint for modern spreadsheets. A quirky detail peeks from the margin of a treatise penned by an Italian agronomist. Follow the Benedictine berry table to allot vineyard rows, but replace elderberry counts with grape clusters. It sounds charmingly improvised, as though the author hijacked a berry tally to suit a wine press. You smear a drop of lamp oil on your finger and trace the cursive loops, imagining Renaissance farmers flipping through monastic notebooks for planting guides. Historians still argue whether these monks consciously drafted proto-bookkeeping methods or simply recorded necessities that later inspired secular codification. The hall's warmth wraps around you as you lift a leather-bound volume stamped with a monk's insignia, and inside you find parallels columns labeled pints, pounds, and sextarii, flanked by notes on rotation schemes. After 3 years of berry beds, sow clover and oats to restore vigor. You sniff a faint whiff of herb bundles that once lined these walls, recalling the infirmary's rosehip and mead scents. A light joke drifts through your mind. If medieval accountants had slack, they'd probably channel strip their harvest channels and tag each other when barley spilled over into berry columns. By the 16th century, retired monastic scribes were hired by noble estates to train lay stewards in granular record-keeping, a mainstream historical fact documented in archival letters from English manors. You picture a former brother in a layman's tunic muttering, "Idleness is the enemy of the accountant's soul," while demonstrating how to rule columns with a stylus. The clay silence of the great hall seems to ripple with their whispered instructions, like the tail end of a tunic flicking through dusty aisles. A fringe rumor, still whispered among archivists, claims that one enterprising abbot added an asterisk of hope next to particularly poor berry yields, believing it would magically encourage future abundance. Supposedly, he even marked the pushpin holes left by parchment fastening nails as astrological indicators, yet historians still debate whether these signs influenced planting calendars or were just doodles born of insomnia. You lean forward, your robe brushing the bench, and examine a margin where a later scribe scrawled a recipe. To convert berry yields to grain equivalents, multiply by 2. Subtract spoilage. That makes your eyebrows quirk in amusement. No modern Excel formula could compete with such idiosyncratic conversion. A second light joke flickers, you'd upload this to GitHub as a berry-to-grain PI script. If only Python ran on vellum. Beyond pure quantity, monastic ledgers influenced the very language of land management. Terms like yield projection, surplus allocation, and rotation scheduling trickled from stone-cold cloisters into the practice of early modern agronomy. You almost swear you hear the quiet scrape of quill as you read footnotes recording projection errors when unexpected frosts halved predicted yields. A mainstream historical fact, such monastic innovations laid groundwork for scientific agriculture, foreshadowing 18th century crop statistics and county surveys. The hall's arched windows blur and the lamps glow, and you recall the scriptorium's conversion table, an artifact of medieval ingenuity, and now see its redder lips in early account books from Flemish estates. You feel the grain of the table surface echo in these leather bindings, a tactile lineage from acorn ink wells to bound account books. A light joke surfaces, if only those Flemish stewards knew they were still borrowing from monks selling best-in-class berry analytics, they might demand royalties. As you turn a page, you find a detailed prologue, a 17th century agronomist praising Benedictine recorders for birthing the art of systematic crop surveillance. You inhale on that phrase, crop surveillance, and imagine medieval CCTV towers peering over fields of blackberries. A fringe whisper insists these agronomists sometimes consulted monastic archives as late as the 19th century for climate change studies, an early nod to using historical yields as environmental data. Though historians still argue whether these records were accurate enough for scientific analysis or skewed by scribal whim. Your fingers loosen on the parchment as you note the colophon copied from original abbey registers by Thomas of Norwich. That bridge from monastic to lay underscores the legacy that scribes with deliberate flourishes and margin doodles unwittingly penned templates for centuries of agricultural bookkeeping. You close your eyes and picture those abbots ticking off yields, unaware they were shaping practices that underpin modern commodity markets and farm management software. A third light joke flashes: if medieval monasteries had owned stock in arable analytics Inc., they'd be retiring on a villa in the Alps by now, sipping elderberry mead in equity-funded vineyards. Yet here you sit, scribbling mental notes in a fading candlelight, tracing the genealogy of harvest accounts from crude vellum lines to digital dashboards. You stand, the volume heavy in your arms, and tread back toward the exit. The lamp's glow dims behind you, but the legacy of those berry tallies remains luminous. Each careful entry, each playful doodle of a winking berry or grinning barrel rippled outward through time, transforming monastic duty into a linchpin of agricultural science and record-keeping. The great hall falls silent as you push open the door, but you carry with you the echo of ledger pages that mapped not just berries, but the very foundation of food economics. Tomorrow, you'll return to survey these manuscripts again, maybe spot a new conversion tweak or lost doodle hiding beneath layers of dust. For now, you step back into the cloister's quiet dusk, knowing that behind every modern spreadsheet lies the indelible ink of monks who counted berries so meticulously that their legacy sprouted far beyond the orchard. You step into the cloister at dusk, the amber glow of lanterns lining the covered walkway, casting long, wavering bands of light across ancient cobblestones. The hush here feels almost sacred, a final exhale after days steeped in ink fermentation and debate. You pause beneath a carved arch, bearing the same vine motifs you've seen dancing through margins, and you sense that tonight the ledger's numbers have slipped back into their silent slumber. A soft breeze stirs the edge of your habit, carrying a whiff of elderflower and crumbled vellum. You lean against a pillar carved with the frost marker of Anno Domini 1032, its weathered grooves whispering of seasons past, and you realize you're here to contemplate the day's final yields and the echoes they leave in empty pages. The clack of a quill dropping into its iron ring echoes from the scriptorium, reminding you of the acorn inkwell lying silent by flickering candlelight. You can almost hear the ghost of Brother Wulfric's flourish, his nib tapping out one last colophon before retiring for the night. A mainstream historical fact grounds you in this moment. Medieval cloisters observed what they called nocturne record-keeping sessions after Vespers to finalize accounts, ensuring that every pint of blackberry or elderberry was faithfully tallied before the day surrendered to sleep. You inhale that faint tannic scent of oak gall ink, and you feel the weight of centuries pressing gently on your shoulders. Above you, a narrow slit window frames a sliver of indigo sky studded with early stars. You recall how monks once believed that the number of stars visible at twilight foretold the next harvest's bounty, a fringed tidbit noted in a tiny margin scrawl, and you wonder whether they truly tracked constellations or simply claimed cosmic influence when yields surprised them. Historians still argue whether these celestial superstitions guided actual harvesting schedules or served as poetic excuses for unpredictable frost. You wander toward the low table, where the day's final entries lie open, neat columns of yields, conversions, and fermented pints waiting to slip onto translated estate ledgers beyond these walls. You run a fingertip along the row labeled Twilight Batch, feeling the raised ridge where the ruling pen scored each line. A light joke flickers. If medieval accountants had Netflix, they'd binge Twilight Batch episodes week after week, though they might veto the popcorn. You try to imagine those evening sessions lit by tallow lamps, scribes murmuring into the cloister's hush as they weighed final barrels. A small cluster of novices drifts by carrying empty jugs and scooping embers for the hearth, their whispers hushed. You catch a snippet about the infirmary's next day recipe refinements, rosehip infusion, and mustard plasters. and you smile at the memory of mixing syrups in Section 8. A callback warms your mind, the syrup's golden glow, and the infirmary ledger's tiny snoring monk doodle now feel like companions on this twilight walk. You pause at the threshold of the fermenting cellar, where sword-like shadows stretch across slumbering barrels. Father Cadful's mastery lingers in the faint odor of spent lees and honey, a reminder of how every drop of mead once foamed beneath your fingertips. Yet now, all is still. A mainstream fact rises from your memory. Medieval cellars were purposely designed to maintain near constant temperatures, after dusk perfect for letting fermentation settle under the cover of night. You close your eyes and inhale the cool, yeasty air, imagining winter grapes tucked in linen fronds, gooseberry shoots resting after a day's growth. A stray candle guttering nearby casts a playful flicker on a stone marker etched with Michaelmas harvest notches. You trace each notch by feel, recalling how every notch once spoke of pilgrims sipping saintly spirits on feast days. A fringe rumor drifts through your thoughts, and some remote abbey's monks sang silent chants at that very marker on Michaelmas Eve, believing the sound waves coaxed sweeter yields the next year, though historians still argue whether this sonic ritual ever took hold or sounds like a medieval earworm. You drift back toward the cloister center, where a marble basin holds water for ritual cleansing. Kneeling, you scoop cool water and touch it to your face, the droplets imprinting on your skin like ink stains on vellum. A light joke surfaces you'd call this medieval face mask, complete with botanical extracts and a bit of berry stain for flair. You shake droplets from your fingertips and watch them catch the lantern's glow, each bead refracting a tiny golden flame. Looking around, you see shadows pooling under wooden benches where the day's records will rest until morning. One bench bears gouges from a runaway barrel in Section 7's Market Day Scramble, a tangible reminder that even tidy ledgers couldn't entirely contain human chaos. You press your palm into a shallow groove and imagine the echo of hoofbeats and merchant haggles reverberating off these stones. A third light joke forms. If medieval logs had GPS trackers, we'd know exactly where that barrel rolled off to. No more head scratching over lost in a transit. You rise and pass beneath arches carved with vine scrolls, their leaves entwining like quills poised over parchment. In the hush, you hear the faint scrape of a stylus, revising a final note. All yields complete, ready for archive. You half expect to see that familiar barrel doodle winking at you from a margin, blessing the ledger's closure with mischievous ink. Instead, you find an empty space, as though the scribe reserved an ink halo for tomorrow's entries. Before you leave, you look back at the cloister's illuminated manuscripts displayed on a lectern, a visual testament to every berry yield transcribed with tempera and shell gold. The colors seem muted under the lamplight, as if settling into slumber alongside the scribes. A mainstream historical fact surfaces monasteries often scheduled rewrites of illuminated pages during long winter nights, preserving artistry and record in sync with agricultural downtime. You imagine those artists brush in hand tracing gilded outlines of berries in a rhythm as soothing as any lullaby. You step through the final arch into the courtyard where moonlight bathes the fountain's gentle trickle. You pause at the fountain's edge and trace a pattern of floating petals, remnants of elderflower wreaths left by novices at vespers. You gather a single blossom and hold it beneath the silver arc of moonlight. Its petals whisper the promise of spring's return and another cycle of yields. Tonight, you carry with you the hush of the cloister, the hum of emptied ink pots, and the memory of every careful measure from dawn to dusk. The ledgers rest, the barrels sleep, and the vines beyond these walls dream of sunlit harvests. You walk slowly across the courtyard, each footstep a quiet benediction for the day's work. The night air drapes around you like a velvet cloak, and your breath drifts before you in pale wisps. Each step echoes softly against stone, a gentle reminder that even in silence movement carries purpose. You slow your pace until you almost float, eyes softening as they trace the arches and shadows that cradled the day's diligent tallying. Somewhere in the distance, the fountain's lullaby continues, a timeless refrain that bridges centuries of rituals and rest. Allow the hush to settle deep within your chest like the final sip of a sweet mead lingering on your tongue. Feel the gentle weight of tasks completed not as burdens, but as offerings laid to rest until morning's light. Notice how the lamp's glow fades in your mind, each flicker replaced by the promise of moonlit calm. Let the distant chiming of a small bell calling monks to silent prayer draw your thoughts inward, closing the ledger of consciousness for now. Here, beneath an ink-dark sky, you are suspended between worlds, the tangible hush of cloister stones and the dreamscape of tomorrow's orchards. Embrace the softness of each breath, the subtle rhythm of your heartbeat echoing the quill's scratch now stilled. You are home in this hush, wrapped in centuries of devotion, creativity, and gentle toil. As your eyelids grow heavy, imagine the pages of this day's ledger closing of their own accord, the margins tucking in their playful doodles for nightly rest. Let the vines and berries nestled beyond these walls sway in silent reverie, their secrets safe until dawn. Here, in this tranquil corridor, you find respite, where history's heartbeat slows and dreams begin to blossom. End of script. Sweet dreams.